Alright guys, this is the online lecture notes for the Crusades, the first meeting in history between Christianity and Islam on the battlefield. In this lecture we're going to be looking at some of the reasons why this thing got going. We'll also, more importantly, be looking at the effects that came about because of it, particularly when it comes to Europe and how it kind of pushed them towards the late High Middle Ages as well as the Renaissance going forward. So the first thing we're going to look at is the reasons why this crusade happened in the first place. In other words, how did this epic series of battles and engagements get going? So the question would be, why did these crusades, why did they get started in the first place? And like a lot of things, there's got to be some kind of push factor or impetus at home to make this thing happen. Well, if you look at the map here, you can see that the map of Europe's not really, doesn't really look like it does at this time. As you can see, there's a lot of different kingdoms, there's a lot of different splits, a lot of different division. Well, during this time period, all these people are fighting each other, and as they are, the Pope feels like it's kind of leading to a breakup of, not necessarily a breakup of Christianity, but a weakening of Christianity. All right, so he tries to find some kind of common purpose to push these guys forward. In other words, why should they spend all their time fighting themselves when they could be fighting somebody else? So one of the first reasons and one of the most important is the unity of Christianity, to get all these people together pushing towards a common cause. Second, there's always an economic motive to most things that we talk about. And the commercial gains that could be made by the Italian states, which are right down here, lead to it as well, because they're going to be the ones who are in charge of kind of transporting and supplying these crusaders as they get to the Holy Land and start fighting. By the way, while I'm thinking about it, we've got a map up. This is the area where we're talking about over here on the right. When I refer to the Holy Land or anything like that, that's where all of these battles and all of these crusades took place. Next is the decline of the Byzantine Empire. Now, they've been kind of on the, on the downswing, I guess you could call it, for a little while before this happens. And the reason for it is because the Turks, as they were referred to, or the Muslims, have been kind of working their way into the Byzantine Empire, putting pressure on them and kind of breaking away at them a little bit. So for that reason, they ask the Pope and Europe for help, and that leads to them sending the troops, along with the other reasons to get these crusades going. And last but not least, and this is more of a justification than a reason, is a harassment of pilgrims going to the Holy Land. They had been assaulted, they've been harassed, some people had been killed, and like many things during this time period, to get their point across, when the Pope is sending his message of why this crusade should happen, he severely exaggerates the things that are going on in an effect to get everybody emotionally invested into this crusade. So here's how this goes down. In 1096, I believe, Pope Urban II calls a Council of Clermont, in which he calls for a crusade to recover the Holy Land. This is kind of, I guess you could call it, the press conference of the Crusades, in which they bring the idea up and then go from there into implementing it, recruiting people to be involved in it, and getting people on board with it. So as far as how recruitment goes, it's one thing to have a crusade or a mass movement of the military or people in theory, but how are you going to actually get people on board? In other words, what are going to be the incentives for people to fight in this thing? So here's the deal. Here are the incentives or the rewards for people who decided to go on crusade. Number one, anything that you did on crusade would be forgiven in the eyes of the church and the Lord. So you could commit the most heinous, atrocious acts you could think of while on crusade, and at the end of the day, when it was all said and done, everything would be forgiven. Number two, if you were a serf, it kind of gave them an idea or hopes of opportunity in the fact that they could leave the land that they had been tied to and been working for their entire lives, and give them some opportunity to go somewhere else to try to, improve their station in life. Number three, during the time you were on crusade, you were exempted from any taxes, which is a huge thing when it comes to the eyes of these upper class lords, barons, whatever you want to call them. And then number four, they freed a lot of prisoners and debtors to go on crusade simply for manpower. So if you were one of those people, it was in your interest to go because it was better than the alternative, which was being in the Middle Ages version of jail. So the next thing is, why did these people want to go? You're going thousands of miles in not great conditions to a place that you've never really been before or don't know a whole lot about to fight an enemy that, once again, you don't know anything about. Well, the motivations kind of all boil down around this religious aspect for most people, is to fight for Christianity and fight for the glory of the Lord and all this kind of stuff. But as well as that, there were also people trying to escape poverty. The Middle East was seen as like a new opportunity, kind of like immigrants coming to America. Like, you're just looking for a chance, really, because the situation you're in is not that great. So anything that you think will improve that, you're going to jump on. Number two, a sense of adventure. Think about it. If you're a 20-year-old knight back in this day who's been fighting little regional wars in Europe or kingdom wars, the chance to go to Crusades and become a hero and live up to all those components of chivalry that you've been, has been banged in your head your entire life, you're going to take that. From a business standpoint, new markets. Middle East is kind of the crossroads or the door into Asia. So a lot of economic opportunity and a lot of chances to get rich there. And in glory and religion as well, like I said. So here's an idea once again of where we're talking about. And these are the routes that were taken on each of the individual major crusades that happened during this time period. We've got the first, second, third, and the fourth. As you can see, man, it's a long trip. We're talking thousands of miles. You're going through a variety of terrains, a variety of climates, and things like that. So it's expensive. It's dangerous. It's difficult. I mean, we're talking about transporting hundreds of thousands of people over to the Middle East. And this does turn out to be one of the main challenges. I mean, the biggest thing, some of the biggest things that they faced happened before they even got to the Middle East and got to the places where they were going to fight, and as far as the journey and everything. So now we're going to move on and take a look at some of the individual crusades and the events and kind of the outcomes and things like that. And obviously we're going to start with the first and probably the most important crusade. So here we go. The first crusade, three pretty important leaders when it comes down to it. You've got Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, who was from France, and Bohemond of Italy, who was obviously from the Kingdom of Italy. One of the things that kind of puts into perspective how they were trying to unite Europe at this time, or the Pope was trying to unite Europe to make this crusade happen. Raymond of Toulouse and Bohemond of Italy, I believe they had been fighting in a little kingdom regional war, at least their families had, just prior to Pope Urban calling the Council of Clermont. So they had to put aside those differences and put aside those, I guess you could call them family feuds, to organize and put together this crusade. So they get marching off on crusade, and their first kind of major stopping point or major roadblock that they run into is in the Byzantine Empire when they get to Constantinople. While they're there, Emperor Alexius holds them for a period of time because he's waiting for an oath of fealty. He wants them to be loyal to him. And the reason he's doing this is because he's worried that once they get done with the Middle East, or even before they get there, they're going to turn around and come back, and they're going to attack the Byzantine Empire and take him over. In other words, he kind of feels like there's ulterior motives going in because Constantinople was one of the richest cities in the world at this time, and it was a prime target for raiders, not just only the Turks or the Muslims, but also, in his eyes and in his fears, the Crusaders as well. So after a bit of time, I mean, these guys have been on the road for over 2 years at this point. They finally reach Jerusalem, and when they get there, it's seen as kind of the triumph of the crusade, even before they take the city over, because they've kind of reached their goal. They've made it to the Holy Land. They've taken cities along the way, like Antioch and others. They've fought hard. They've had a lot more resistance than I think they thought they were going to. So when they get there, the events that happen are a combination or a result of the frustration and of the anger of them having to fight so hard to get there. And also it's kind of a mindset of the way war worked during this time. So they go into Jerusalem and they take it once the gates are open, and carnage ensues. I mean, it was chronicled that the blood ran knee deep in Jerusalem. They slaughtered 70,000 Muslims, which was not uncharacteristic for the way war worked during this time. I mean, it was seen as the spoils of war. When you got in the city, you kind of got to run rampant until you kind of, wore yourself out, I guess you could say. Jews were burned while trapped in a synagogue, along with other things. So it's not really a bright point on the Crusades, but it's kind of indicative of the way things worked back then. So that ends the first crusade. As far as what happened after, it's mainly political stuff. It's them setting up crusader states and all these kinds of things. And over a period of time, the Muslims start to come back in, and they eventually go back in and start to take over, and the threat is seen again in Europe. So in response to that, a second crusade is called to go back and get Jerusalem back into the hands of Christianity. Like I said, the reason is that it's purely the Muslim threat. They're getting a little more organized. There's a little more unity. If the Crusades did nothing else, they united Muslims across the Middle East and Northern Africa, because before this time, they were set up kind of like Europe was before the Crusades. There wasn't a lot of unity. These regional powers were fighting back and forth in these different sects and different divisions in Islam and different tribes, I guess you could say. Were fighting each other, and once the Crusaders come in and take Jerusalem, and through the events of 70,000 Muslims being slaughtered, it unified the whole caliphate, and as that happens, the threat is seen once again, so a second crusade is called to go kind of stamp this out. So when the Second Crusade is called, 2 leaders are appointed to lead this thing, and they're King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany, as you can see in the lovely pictures right here. So as the Second Crusade gets going, most people in Europe assume that it's going to be like the first, which was actually the only successful crusade that was done during these series of wars, and there were actually 7 crusades in all. Most people just assumed that they'd go in, knock the Muslims out, and put Jerusalem back in the hands of Christianity. Well, this one doesn't work out anywhere close to that. It's a complete and utter disaster. It's unorganized. It gets started late. There's a lot of arguing between the French and the German troops that really comes to a head once Conrad, the guy from Germany, that you remember from the last slide, once he dies. And if I'm not mistaken, I think he dies when he falls off his horse and drowns in a river, which kind of happens if you think about having all that armor on. So when that happens, the German troops are not going to listen to the French troops, so it's just kind of a horrible combination of things going on even before they get there. And once they do, they're completely annihilated. And the result and the reaction in Europe is one of complete shock. They feel like it makes them look at themselves. They feel like this didn't work because of the way that we're acting, because of the fact that we're sinning in Europe. So God has humiliated us to send a message and have us get our things back in order, get our house back in order, I guess you could say. So really, that's the only thing notable about the Second Crusade. Not a lot happened. It really never got off the ground. It didn't work once it did, and it was a complete disaster. So we move forward to the Third Crusade, which is really the second best known in these series of wars. So as far as the Third Crusade goes, the main storyline is the meeting or the clash of 2 of the greatest military leaders in history, and certainly of this time period. You've got Richard the Lionheart from the Crusader states from England, who ironically never visited England while he was king, and Saladin, who was the Muslim leader at this time and seemed to be one of the greatest military minds, geniuses, whatever you want to call it, in Islamic history. And the things that happened during the Crusade, while not pertinent to our storyline, really show how there was a certain level of respect between these 2 guys, as well as the, once again, genius of their military tactics and things. Look, all it boils down to is that when you get 2 guys that are this good on the battlefield, it's going to be hard for somebody to win. And what happens is, over a period of time, it ends up being more or less a stalemate. In other words, nobody really wins, so they sign a truce. And this truce is signed on September 2nd, 1192, in which they decide that Richard the Lionheart gets to keep the coastal cities on the Mediterranean that they'd already captured. And this is partly done for economic reasons and also to supply the Crusader states that the Christians still hold in the Middle East. Also, free passage between territories. When it comes to pilgrims going to the Holy Land, they opened Jerusalem back up to Christian pilgrims. And also, in return for the protection for the pilgrims, Muslims were allowed to keep controlling Jerusalem. So there's a little bit of give and take in it, and it kind of, I don't know, it's not necessarily the status quo, but out of this truce, nobody really gets a huge advantage on the terms of it. So really, for our purposes, the biggest thing we need to talk about is the effect of the Crusades. And like I said at the beginning of this, the things that come out of it, be it technological, be it cultural changes, be it whatever it is, really kick Europe off into the what's called High Middle Ages, which eventually morphs into the ideals of the Renaissance. And I don't think the Renaissance, I don't think a lot of that stuff would have happened if not for the precedents and the origins of the things that happened because of the Crusades. And because of that exposure to the Middle East and what's called the Orient aspect of it. So the first thing is the failures. In other words, what did not work out of the Crusades? What ended up being a disadvantage for Europeans? So the first thing that happens, or the first failure of the Crusades, is that by attacking the Holy Land, it ends up resulting in Muslim intolerance for Christians who are already in the Middle East. So there's a sense of resentment, there's a sense of anger, that, you know, a sense of how dare these people come into our lands, attack us and try to take over. So after they're all over, there's there's tension between Christians and Muslims from that point on that even in a certain way and extent even extends to today. Also, the influence of the church declines. Remember, we're talking going back to the medieval church PowerPoint, talking about how the church was the biggest authority in people's lives and was seen to be infallible, seen to do no wrong. In other words, if they came up with an idea, it's going to have to work because it's deemed by God, it's tapped by God. By the Crusades not really working out the way that they thought they would, it took away some of the shine, I guess you could call it, off of the church. And it also hurt Europe's ego. They thought they were the end-all, be-all civilizations during this time, when in fact, if you compare them to the same period in Islamic lands, they didn't have the art, they didn't have the architecture, they didn't have the military prowess or the military technology or the organization, and they found out that they really, in fact, weren't the top of the world at this time. So it kind of forced them to step back for a second, take a look at themselves, and figure out how they can advance and kind of catch up to what they saw when they got to the Middle East. Now, don't for a second think that these failures were the biggest things. There were several successes or several advantages that came out of this for Europe during this time. Number one was new opportunities for serfs. As they went to the Middle East, as they went on crusade and they came back, there were new opportunities that were available to them. Number two, it did put a little bit of chink in the armor of the Muslim armies. It made them look at themselves a little bit too, because even though they, in the long run, I guess you could say, won, they still suffered plenty of defeats. They still had plenty of downtime. So it weakened them as a whole. Much less, as this goes on, there seem to be little cracks after Saladin, after the Third Crusade. There seem to be kind of cracks that form, or divisions that form within the different parts of Islam. And also, and most importantly, it enhanced trade and exploration. It opened up new trade routes. It brought in new products. It made new contacts. It led to the rise of Venice and Genoa and Pisa and the Italian states, and then led Italy, kind of kicked them off towards the Renaissance. So some of the products and some of the things that they got because of the Crusades led to a desire for these. And this is mostly luxury goods, but led to a desire for these goods and opened Europe up to the wider world, I guess would be the best way to put it. So that is a very, very, very short, condensed version of the Crusades. You need to look at this for quiz purposes, obviously. Some of the stuff we'll talk about as we move on. But as far as the basics go, and like I said, it's more the reasons and the effects of it that you need to concern yourself with. Appreciate you listening.